Updated Free On Board FOB, Incoterm 2020 Rules. The Free On Board, FOB, trade term is the most commonly used, but in practice, it is used without referencing any version of the Incoterms rules. This means that the buyer and seller need to agree in their contract on what they mean when they use these three letters. A brief introduction to Free On Board, FOB. Originally used during the sailing ship era, in Incoterms 2020, the seller must carry their goods on board the ship nominated by the buyer. The buyer is then responsible for any damage or loss to the goods after that. Putting the goods on board no longer involves placing them on the ship's rail, and it is not defined any further since it will be for the contract to specify depending on the nature of the goods. The buyer's responsibility is to pay the shipping costs, with the bill of lading typically indicating freight collect. The seller must handle export formalities and import formalities by the buyer. In a bill of lading, the shipper should be the buyer and not the seller because the buyer contracts for carriage. To claim VAT/GST, the seller will likely require a copy of the bill of lading or a copy of the mate's receipt. If a letter of credit is involved, the seller is listed on the bill of lading as the shipper. The seller should understand the risks they agree to under the terms and conditions of the bill of lading. Intro and History of Free On Board, FOB, Incoterms 2020. FOB is not appropriate for container shipments because the carrier receives the cargo at a location, that is a distance away from the port, such as a container yard or even the seller's property. It has been used since the days of sailing ships. Since the first Incoterms registered edition in 1936, the concept has remained unchanged. For the contract to be valid, the buyer must be the one who contracts for the vessel space on the vessel, and the seller must load the goods on that vessel. Interestingly, the seller was only required to deliver the goods on board, but the cost split was that the seller bore all costs and risks until the goods passed over the ship's rail, which caused great confusion and attorney fees for decades. So what is the best way to allocate cost and risk at the point while the goods are suspended over the ship's rails? With the 2010 version, the cost and risk matter have been aligned with delivery, eliminating the reference to the rail. Why using Free On Board for container shipments is not okay. FOB is typically treated by sellers and buyers as a price point, with the seller not paying the freight and the buyer paying it. It is a way that freight forwarders understand that local charges in the export country will have to be paid by the buyer, that the transport document will be marked collect, and the buyer is responsible for paying the freight charges. Their instructions to the seller will typically provide 3 or 4 options, and FOB will be included, whether the goods are transported by container or air. FOB is not acceptable for most transactions handled by freight forwarders, whether it is LCL, FCL, ground, or air. FOB is not appropriate for goods that are handed over to the carrier before they are on board the vessel, such as containers delivered at a terminal. In such cases, we should use the FCA rule. Specifically, in the new explanatory notes for users for the 2020 version, the rule is outlined as follows. This rule only applies to parties intending to deliver goods by putting them on a vessel. Therefore, the FOB rule is not suitable when goods are handed over to the carrier before they are on board the vessel, such as at a container terminal. This is when the FCA should be used instead of the FOB rule. Do container shipments FOB make any sense in light of this apparent setback? If everyone does it, why do the rules not accommodate it? FOB Incoterms 2020 defines delivery when goods are delivered on board the vessel by their seller. The seller is almost never able to do this when the goods are containerized. For goods that will be shipped in a full container load, FCL, the seller usually packs the container on site or delivers the goods to a facility designated and packed by the buyer's carrier. Typically, the container is then taken to a terminal or container yard, CY, contracted by the shipping line in the port to await the arrival of a vessel to load it. Less than container load, LCL, goods are either picked up by the buyer's carrier or delivered to a container freight station, CFS, by the seller. They are consolidated with other goods into a container. Then, the container moves as described above. Once the goods leave the seller's possession and are in the carrier's possession and control, the seller has no direct control over or knowledge of what is happening to the goods. Indeed, the seller cannot deliver the goods on board the ship. Free on board, FOB, seller and buyer obligations, costs, and risks. FOB, A1/B1 General obligations. A1, General obligations, seller. Every seller is expected to submit the goods as required by the contract of sale, their commercial invoice, and any other evidence of conformity that might be applicable and specified in the contract, such as an analysis certificate or weighbridge document. According to the rules, any document may be in paper form or electronic form, as agreed in the contract, or customary if it does not appear in the contract. Unfortunately, there are no definitions for electronic form. It could be anything from a PDF file to a blockchain or some form yet to be developed in the future. B1, General obligations, buyer. Every contract of sale specifies the price that the buyer must pay. Neither the rules specify when the payment should be made, before shipment, immediately after shipment, 30 days after shipment, 50% advance, or whatever, or how to make the payment, prepayment, presented to a bank upon presentation of documentation, or any other arrangement. The contract should include this information. FOB, A2/B2, delivery. A2, delivery, seller. Deliveries are normally subject to a vessel being nominated or available by the buyer, on the agreed date or at the end of the agreed time frame, if no time frame is defined. Traditionally, the ship's rail has been the defining point, that is, the seller's risk is before the imaginary vertical line above the rail, and the buyer's risk is after the rail. But, according to the court, the delivery point was the deck when the goods were on it, so was the imaginary vertical line along the deck, replaced with an imaginary horizontal line to match. And what if the goods were placed below the deck? Incoterms 2010 removed the concept of a ship's rail. As such, on board refers to goods safely on deck or in the hold. Also, in contracts for bulk goods such as grain, the seller and buyer must determine what security measures to take, if they have to lash, separate, or spread evenly in the hold, and who bears the costs and risks. B2, delivery, buyer. After the goods have been delivered under the A2 article on delivery, it is the buyer's responsibility to take delivery. FOB, A3/B3, transfer of risk. A3, transfer of risk, seller. The seller bears all risks of loss or damage until the products are delivered under the A2 article on delivery. Except in the circumstances described in B3, where loss or damage varies based on the role played by the buyer. B3, transfer of risk, buyer. When the seller delivers the goods described in Article A2 on delivery, the buyer takes responsibility for any damage or loss to the goods. If the buyer fails to communicate where and when a vessel will arrive, or the vessel does not take delivery, the buyer is responsible for loss or damage to goods. FOB, A4/B4, carriage. A4, carriage, seller. The seller is not required to contract for carriage. However, suppose the buyer requests the seller. In that case, it must provide the seller, at the buyer's risk and cost, any information known by the buyer, including transport-related security requirements, that the seller needs to arrange carriage. Sellers who agree to contract for carriage must do so at the usual terms, as usually stated in the contract or determined by prior dealings between the parties, which is at the risk and expense of the buyer. The seller's responsibility is to comply with any security requirements related to shipping, but only until delivery. B4, carriage, buyer. The buyer's responsibility is to contract for carriage from the port of shipment, unless it is agreed that the seller makes the contract of carriage as described in the A4 article on the carriage. FOB, A5/B5, insurance. A5, insurance, seller. Since the seller is not responsible for anything beyond delivery, a contract of insurance is not necessary. On the other hand, if the buyer requests it, the seller must provide the buyer with any relevant information on its record, that the buyer will need to arrange its insurance at the buyer's risk and expense. B5. Insurance, buyer. Although the buyer risks loss or damage to the goods from the delivery point, they are not obligated to insure them. Whether the buyer insures the items themselves or bears the risk is entirely up to them. FOB, A6/B6, Delivery/Transport Document. A6, Delivery/Transport Document, Seller. Sellers must provide the buyer with the normal proof of delivery of goods under A2 at their own expense. At the buyer's request, risk, and expense, the seller must assist the buyer in obtaining a transport document, unless this proof is a transport document. As a rule, the seller often arranges to furnish a buyer with proof that shows the seller as the consignor or the mate's receipt, issued by the shipmaster. B6, Delivery/Transport Document, buyer. Proof of delivery provided by the seller must be accepted by the buyer. FOB, A7/B7, Export/Import Clearance. A7, Export/Import Clearance, Seller. Like all multimodal rules, FOB terms can be used for both domestic and international transactions. Sellers are required to complete all export clearance formalities required by the country of export, including licenses, permits, security clearances, pre-shipment inspections, and any other required approvals at their own expense. Sellers are under no obligation to arrange transit/import clearances. However, at the buyer's expense and risk, the seller should assist the buyer in obtaining documents and information related to formalities required by the country of transit or import, such as permits or licenses, security clearance, and pre-shipment inspection needed by the transit/import authorities. B7, Export/Import Clearance, buyer. Whenever necessary, the buyer must assist the seller, at the seller's risk and expense, in obtaining all documents and information needed to complete all export-related formalities in the country of export. The buyer must complete and pay for all formalities required by any country of transit and any importing country. For example, import licenses and permits are needed for transit and import, clearances for imports, security checks for transit and import, and pre-shipment inspections. Because these are after-delivery charges, the buyer is responsible for them. At first glance, it might seem strange that both the seller and the buyer are responsible for pre-shipment inspections. However, if it's a requirement of the country of export, the seller is responsible, whereas if it's a requirement of the country of transit or import, the buyer is responsible. FOB, A8/B8, Checking/Packaging/Marking. A8, Checking/Packaging/Marking, Seller. As a general rule, the seller is responsible for all quality checking, measuring, weighing, counting, and other quality check operations necessary to deliver the goods. As well as packaging the goods, the seller will have to pay for the packaging, unless it is customary for the trade of these goods that unpackaged goods are sold. Bulk goods are a good example. Further, the seller should pack the goods appropriately to ensure safe transportation. If there is no express agreement in the contract, the goods must be marked or packaged as required. B8, Checking/Packaging/Marking, buyer. As far as packaging and marking are concerned, the buyer has no obligation to the seller. Nevertheless, there may be exceptions in practice, such as when the buyer provides labels or logos to the seller. FOB, A9/B9, Allocation of Costs. A9, Allocation of Costs, Seller. Sellers are responsible for all costs related to delivery under the A2 article on delivery, including loading on board the vessel, but not B9. Typically, the seller is responsible for any costs involved in providing the usual proof that goods have been delivered. However, if the contract requires a bill of lading as proof, Any fees involved are the seller's responsibility. Any export clearance costs, duties, or taxes are the seller's responsibility. The seller must pay the buyer for information or documents the buyer provides to assist the seller in their export procedures. B9. Allocation of costs, buyer. After delivery, the buyer is generally responsible for all costs related to the goods, except those owned by the seller. The buyer must reimburse the seller's costs if the seller has assisted the buyer with information or documents needed to ensure loading on board, carriage, import formalities, insurance, and preparation of the transport document. All costs of transit and import clearance are paid by the buyer when applicable. A buyer must also pay any additional costs incurred by the seller if the buyer fails to nominate the vessel. If the vessel fails to take the goods from the seller, or the vessel closes for cargo prior to when the buyer informed the seller. FOB, A10/B10, Notices. A10, Notices, Seller. When goods have been loaded on a vessel or have failed to take possession as agreed, the seller must notify the buyer. One example would be when a vessel arrives in the port for loading on March 31 but cannot load until April 1, even though March was the agreed delivery period. B10, Notices, Buyer. When the buyer transacts with the seller, he must inform the seller of the vessel's name, the operational point within the port, and any security-related requirements that apply after loading the vessel. Usually, the contract will specify these. Recap. FOB means that the seller has fulfilled its obligation when the goods are loaded on the vessel. A FOB agreement means that the seller is responsible for loading the goods on the transport, and the buyer is responsible for everything else linked to getting the goods to their final destination. The buyer is responsible for the goods once they are on board the ship. Thank you for watching, and I hope the information provided in this video gives you a better understanding of the Incoterms rule for FOB. Do drop me your comments and let me know your thoughts. Coming soon, CFR, Cost and Freight. To be the first to watch the next video, please subscribe to my channel and click on the notification bell. Goodbye. From your trusted shipping guide. Revisit.